I think actually it the way we relate to our fathers, I feel, has a massive, massive impact on how we relate to God.
Welcome to the latest On Being Human podcast. And we're joined by Julian, who is a friend of mine for the past 30, 35 years. This conversation started, the three of us, so Julian, myself, and Eveline, in a quirky little town pub in England. And as we were talking, themes appeared. So themes around selfishness, themes around sacrifice, and what shapes our idea of the divine. So we decided we needed to continue the conversation and we'd record it. Sometimes you'd be aware that there was a previous conversation that this came out of, but it does make sense in its own right. Welcome, Julian, to the On Being Human podcast. Really pleased that you can join us today. Feels like we started this conversation around the human experience and the stories and the narratives that we bring to that, or others bring to our lives, a few weeks ago when we were just meeting socially, the three of us.
It's really good to chat to you both. Thanks for inviting me on. I've been thinking a little bit more, and I was just reading the other day, and it was something Jesus said, actually. He says something along the lines of, if you want to follow me, his words were deny yourself or give up and follow me and take up your cross and follow me. And I was thinking, actually, firstly, I'm not really sure what that means. And secondly, that's something that I have to now, 40 years later, unpack and say, actually, is that really helpful? Is it something that I really think is useful for me? Denying, giving up, sacrificing everything for somebody else. And that was an interesting point. I chose to do something as a 10-year-old. And it was a very simple thing. It was to do with family. It was to do with my little brother. And I was laying the table and we had different placemats. And there was one he particularly liked and I particularly liked. And I can remember, and we used to like fight over it and squabble and all that sort of stuff. And I decided this particular day, no, I'm going to choose to give him what I want. And that obviously impacted me because 40, 50 years later, more than 50 years later, I can still remember that as a moment in time when I made a choice to do something for somebody else, put somebody else first. And I think that's probably shaped who I am to a great extent over the next 50 years.
So when I listen to you talk, Julian, I get really curious about how it has shaped you. So my own philosophy is that these stories, they all have their beautiful sides, their helpful sides, and maybe the less helpful side. And I'm curious if you would share with us some thoughts that you have around both of those aspects, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I think from a helpful point of view, it makes you realize that when you make a choice like that it's not all about you. There are other people involved. And the positive side of doing that is seeing the joy, the happiness that it brings to another person, rather than grief or fighting or whatever. The downside, I think, for me, is that I continually do that. I continually sacrifice. I continually give up stuff for other people, which is fine, but there's a cost involved.
And what is the cost? Could you describe that to us?
Sacrifice. And it's not necessarily receiving what you need sometimes. There's a loss involved. There is a loss involved in doing that for other people, which again is okay, because going back to what Jesus said, he encouraged us to do that, to put other people first. And actually, he didn't just say that, he did that, didn't he?
So it's really interesting because you introduced that word loss. There's almost like there was a sense of part of this process is I sacrifice, and therefore there's inevitably some loss. For me, that's what sacrifice is. But what is the loss for you?
I'm not really sure I can answer that at the moment.
Sounds like you're in the middle of this process, Julian.
Oh, yeah, I am. And I have been for a number of years. And I probably will be for a number of more years. I think the thing that has probably also impacted me, apart from the choices I make, is something that actually my dad said to me probably 50 years ago, no, 40 years ago, was very much, they were church people, went to church, Christians, whatever. He said to me one day, don't believe it just because we do. You need to find out for yourself and question what it's all about. So I was given the freedom almost to question. Now, that in itself, when you start doing that, affects the way you live your life, because you start questioning stuff, and the sides of the box have now been removed. So you're not inside the box accepting everything for what people say it is. You're now outside the box saying, well, what about this? What about that? So I feel really, really privileged to be able to have questioned and given the freedom to do that.
I feel quite envious of you, Julian. We've done a number of podcasts now and listening to different life experiences and how the reality being that the stories that we create or others create really do shape us. So that simple little thing, an encouragement to bring curiosity and questioning, is so different than when I was brought up. It was the opposite. Don't question, don't bring curiosity to it. This is just how it is. So listening to you talk and reflecting on my own experience as well, I'm thinking how different that is. That little statement, it's okay to question, or a positive, it's not okay to, I proactively encourage you to question, is so different than don't question. The fear of what happens if you do question is immense, whereas it feels like slightly different than for you, because you've had the other narrative, other story put in, which is it's okay to question, it's okay to bring curiosity.
But then the other extreme sometimes can be, I wonder about, people that are encouraged to always question everything. It stifles you as well.
We're on a podcast, you can't see this. I was just pointing at Eveline then.
Yeah. I think my parents question a lot. They like to live outside of maybe set structures. And of course, I grew up in a mixed bag of cultures, both, geographical as well as social, cultural cultures. So Catholic schooling when I was really young, but then moving into different systems from the age of 10. And that's been a bit chaotic at times for me, this idea of questioning everything. So then what is left to hold on to? And I find myself sometimes searching for that. I spent a lot of my life being a bit of a chameleon. I also have a very strong social, like a pleaser story and pleaser narrative. But just trying on different narratives for size, see if they fit, almost, as opposed to going a little bit deeper and feeling like, well, what's my foundation? Is there a foundation? Is there something underneath all of this that catches me if I just let it go? If I let go of the external narratives. But that's a really terrifying process. It's not very comfortable.
I think for me, the thing that holds it all together, the thing that if it all fell apart and I hit the bottom, as it were, it does come back to my Christian upbringing, I suppose, is the fact that God loves me, whatever that means, whoever he is, or she is, or whatever. I know I'm God's child. So, and that will never change. And that's actually, I believe, is true for everybody, whether or not we recognize it. And I have a deep, deep sense of acceptance and love from God.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you can look at a load of different traditions and things that have been written about and have always been written about who say exactly the same. Yeah, and taking off the box, if you like, around who that is, how that works, what does that really mean, but that deep sense. I think it's really interesting. I had an experience probably 15 years ago. It was really uncomfortable. I was driving somewhere and that question about where will I land? What will catch me almost?
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember letting go in my head as I was driving all of the beliefs that I had, that I was aware of, about, that I'd grown up with, and having a physical feeling of falling. And it was terrifying. I was driving at the time and it's like, whoa, what is going to catch me? What is the rock that I sit on? Is there anything? Or do I just keep falling? For me, it's terrifying, but actually I'm really glad that I've learned to do that a bit, because then you realize there is something, I just don't have words for it sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I became curious about when I was listening to you, Julian. How do you experience, the love, the being God's child? Do you sit with that sometimes? Does it land for you? Does it appear for you? And if so, how is that?
It's just there. It's just part of me. No, I can't really explain it. It's just something deep within me that I know about and I experience. And I think, going back a bit, I think actually the way we relate to our fathers, I feel, has a massive, massive impact on how we relate to God. And I think my sense of God is there, I know he's there, and he will always be there, is come out of my experience of my father, because he was always there. He was just there all the time. I mean, sometimes he went away for 6 months working, etc., but he was always there. He was always a presence. And I think that's impacted me quite significantly. He wasn't particularly affectionate or anything like that, but he was just there. And I found that very grounding, I guess.
So it sounds like not just the way that your dad was, has helped shape you and your view, but also there was that thing about the stories that he had shaped him and the way that he was with you, the thing that he brought. Do you know what I mean? So there was all of these stories are so intertwined, aren't they? So, and I hope it's all right, because it's really interesting, this, because it's like I hadn't known this. I've known a little bit about your dad, Julian, but I don't know loads. And then I'm thinking about my own dad, and it's like, wow, my dad was just someone to kick against. That's all he ever was. I think that's how I experienced it, and that's what So it's all of a sudden, right. So that shapes probably how I view anything that's there to be kicked against. It's there to be kicked against. So it's really interesting, isn't it? How strong that shaping comes.
Oh.
And I know that he was like that through his own story. And I know a little bit about that to understand, well, yeah, he was just living the story that he'd been given. And I'm not sure that maybe he never found the choice in it. Yeah, he just carried on living it.
And it makes you think about the story you're passing on to your children.
Oh, that's terrifying. Yeah. That's terrifying, Julian.
My two older boys lived with their mum when they were little, and there are consequences of not being there. You have to be aware of that, but obviously that then becomes their story.
I love that sense of sometimes our role is to not get involved or accept the limits of our involvement in someone else's story, but be there so that they can help make sense of their story.
This is a really big thing of mine that I'm really into, is that there will need to be forgiveness from them. Because they're taking on our story, it's becoming their story, and they'll look at it and think, you didn't do very well there, did you? So I've had to say to one of my boys, you will need to forgive me for what I've done. And it's quite difficult, really, because they have to then start processing and taking on board. And I think for me, one of the biggest things also about my story is forgiveness, because people hurt you, do wrong to you. And it's what do you do with that when that happens? And it comes down to you've got a choice. And always, however hard it might be, choose to forgive. Because it does something to me. It actually sets me free from that. And I can see the consequences of not forgiving. I've seen people who can't forgive, and it's really sad how it affects their life because they've chosen not to do that. I think it's really healthy and wholesome to forgive because you're then not bound by the past. You can move on.
Well, Julian, we're coming to the end of our conversation. As with all of these podcasts we've been doing, I get to the end and I think, wow, okay, there's a load in here. And also on an individual level, I've been impacted by some of the stuff that we've talked about and what that mean for my own story. And it's been really great, Julian, having this conversation, a continuation from the conversation in a pub in the southwest of England a few weeks ago.
By way of introduction, who am I? I would say I'm just like a river running through the countryside. Or something in the river, following the flow of the river. I feel like I'm somebody who's on a journey. I'm a father of 4 boys, all of whom I am immensely proud in because they've found their own way and they've made their own choices. And I think that's what makes me proud about my boys. And that's what gives me joy, I think, is the fact that I've given them freedom to be who they are. So who am I? Just some bloke wandering along, enjoying life and wanting to make the most of every day. I like to cry a lot as well.
So in the interview with Julian, he spoke at some point about his own father and how his own father was, in some ways, or the relationship that he has with his own father was representative for the relationship that he has with the divine. And it was a really interesting moment for me in our conversation because it did a lot with me internally. I started to ask myself questions about, first of all, my own relationship to my own dad and who I see my dad as, and whether that is somehow also correlated or representative for my own relationship with the divine. But I also started asking questions as a single mom who's primarily been raising her own daughter single-handedly about her relationship to the divine, given the relationship that she has with her own dad. And it unsettled me. It left a residue in me about, was that true for me, and what about it might be true or might be different? And I don't think I have an immediate answer, just that the question stayed with me about what shapes our connection to the divine, because I feel like I have quite a strong connection to the divine in my own way. And I feel like I've always had it. I can remember as a child even having it very strongly. I speak to it more from a place of, that's my intuition, or it's my intuitive connection to the universe, to source. That's the language that I use around it. But I'm not sure that it was necessarily shaped by my parental relationships. So in some ways, I almost feel that I'm just going with what I'm feeling right now. But in some ways, I feel like that was like a primal relationship that existed even before I understood who parents are and who other people are and what my relationship to myself and to others, even before that concept existed of individuation. I feel like the connection to the divine is somehow underneath all of that, almost like a little pilot flame, and that is there. We're born with it. It lives inside of us. And then we all come to it in different ways, or we can choose to return to it, or there are teachers or pathways that we're offered as we sort of move through life that can turn us inwards back towards that little pilot flame. And we can feed that flame, and that flame can grow into something. And at times it'll dim. So that's, I think, more the way that I would understand my relationship to the divine.
As I'm listening to you talk about this, the image I have is about, it feels like, if I think about my own experience around this, so yeah, this idea of this primal connection with the divine that is underneath everything else. And then I think about my experience, which probably has some links to sort of Julian's experiences, that actually quite quickly there's a framework of what that ought to look like gets put on or placed on top of that flame. You talk about this little pilot flame. I was with one of my brothers last week, and we had a lovely fire out on the side of some beautiful hills, watching the stars come out. It was amazing. But we were having this really interesting conversation about, it was a windy night, it was quite cold, the wood was a bit damp, about how you nurture the fire. And if you put on too much stuff too quickly in the wrong way, what it did, it actually doused the fire, not nurtured it into life. So you had to keep doing things like moving some logs to let some more air in, so it would grow, so it would catch fire. And it feels like that's what you're talking about. Is here's this initial spark, and how do we gently allow that to grow and not put too much on it so it squashes it. And I wonder, when there are too many expectations, or a lot of expectations around what that ought to look like, I wonder if that's one of the things that douses it does something to that little primal flame. Because if it doesn't look in a particular way, then it's almost like that flame starts to flicker, and I can't be here because I'm not the right flame almost. I come from quite a patriarchal background.
sort of in terms of family and tradition and views of divinity. I'm aware that it can be so limiting. So the question I'm left with is, just as two, is maybe for both of us, is what has helped keep that flame, that primal flame about a connection with the divine, whatever we mean by that, and what are the things that maybe squash it a little bit or make it hard for that thing to keep burning. It sounds like that whole framework, that whole patriarchal framework, then automatically excludes a whole load of experiences around connection with divinity in some way.
So the additional question that came up for me listening to you was, and I wonder how far this may also be true for Julian, is when you're raised into a system that says, well, the divine comes through the Father, the Holy Father. Is it so that then you see your connection through the divine, through relationships to the men in your life, like male teachers or male figures? So the question that I had was, how does your divine connection appear? So who are some teachers that come up for you instinctively, just out of curiosity, that feed your connection to the divine?
Wow. It's a great question, because I think 10 years ago, I would have probably given you a list of people. Probably most of them would have been men, and not always positive. Do you know what I mean? But they've all shaped my understanding or the connection with the divine. So some of it's created some anger. Well, if that is what the divine is like, he is like you, because in my upbringing, it was a he, then actually I don't want anything to do with the divine. As well as, oh, here's some people who role model or something that's like, I can see something really helpful in it. I had a really interesting conversation with my son yesterday. He's about to do his dissertation at university, and he's going to do something around ecofeminism. Yeah. About understanding how narratives around feminism are useful in the way that we view the environment and how we treat environment and stuff. What I've noticed is that I think I've been on this journey which moves away from, I don't want to understand the divine through that masculine thing. Yeah, because it's too problematic. And then one of the places I've gone to is nature. So that, for me, that is the place where I experience or I connect with the divine more than anywhere else. And then alongside that, there's, hang on a minute, there's this other beautiful and different way of viewing the world from a more feminine view. How do I learn to allow that to fan the flame? So I think there's these three things. There's a moving away from something, stepping into something that feels really comfortable for me, which is the nature thing, and then inviting in that space. How do I bring in this or allow to be taught about divinity from a different aspect, from a different view? So I think actually for me, it's less people and it's more ideas. I did an experiment. I don't think I've talked about this before. I can remember the day, and I woke up and thought, today I am going to look to pay attention to the divine. And the way that I think the way that I was describing divine in that particular day was, I'm going to see that if I can pay attention to how love turns up everywhere. I can remember going to the train station. This person got off the train now, and I'm going to describe him, and it may sound like I'm being a little bit judgmental or caricatures, but I have sort of done quite a lot of work with young offenders in prisons. And through that, you sometimes get a bit of a sense of people. You can see something, they're interesting. And you can sometimes, especially in young men, you can see this aggression that they carry towards the world. And this person, the door had opened, and there was this young man who I was like, whoa, he looks like he's just come out of being in prison or something. And he had this look about him and this aggression around how he's looking around. And I was thinking, Well, my invite for today was to see the love in everything. And I was like really struggling, thinking, wow, because all I had was judgments in my head around this person. And then obviously his partner, or whether it's his partner or obviously the mother of his child came onto the platform carrying a baby, I don't know, probably under a year old. And something transformed in him in just a millisecond. And he came off and he walked over and he picked the baby up. And then you say, right, I have noticed something else about this person. I've noticed the thing that is in all of us. And something's happened that has allowed it to be seen, which is partly to do with that connection he had with his child. But it was also, I think, actually to do with, I was willing to pay attention to it and see it somehow. So there's these two things. And I do wonder, you said something earlier about shaping how we view the divine. And then you also talked about something taking shape. And I wonder if that's key, that little switch of phrases. One of the things we do is we try and put shape on it. We try and put form on the divine, as opposed to allow the divine to take shape. And I think they're two really different things. And I wonder when we say, the divine needs to look like this, yeah. And the way that we can see that is by looking at our parents or whatever. We start to define what the divine is, as opposed to, I'm just going to pay attention to the divine and how it turns up.
Just an add-on question then, because I think this is really interesting. How would you invite people to start to recognize the divine? And also, what is it that blocks it?
Such a good question. And I'm stood and I'm doing this podcast. I'm looking out a window and I'm looking at the rain and I'm looking at some trees and the fields. And all I can feel is it's about openness. It's about how do I keep my heart and my mind and my body open to what we might call the divine, whether that's the mystery or the force or whatever you want to call it. Can I keep myself open enough to experience it? Does that sound like a good invitation to leave listeners with?
I would say so.
Well, I'm going away with lots of threads of thoughts and feelings going on in me that I think I'm going to process a little bit more after this conversation. So thanks, Eveline, for that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.